Within this video, we will explain you where to place transformers, which places you can place transformers, how that would look like for the data, and how you can use those. So first of all, you are probably familiar with the entity transformer page, and within this environment, we already have a whole bunch of transformers, which we could place somewhere. Then if we look at the connections, this is showing all of the places where we could place transformers, for example. The first place where we can put a transformer is on the incoming configuration before the data comes in. Then the next place is on the incoming configuration after the data came in. Then we can also place transformers on the route, and we can also place transformers on the outgoing configuration. The reason why we have this many places to put entity transformers will be explained further in this video. So first of all, if we go to an incoming configuration that's already configured, we have an incoming configuration here, and we're talking to a certain endpoint, but we also define a key of like a date that is a dynamic date. For that, to fill that dynamic date, we can actually use a value setter within the input transformer, which is, as mentioned, the first place where you could put a transformer. So this is before the data comes in. So here you can use a transformation that you can use to make your call based upon. For example, here, introducing a key of yesterday, mapping that towards -1 day, and then placing that key over here in the date value of the request parameters. With that, we can use the first place of the transformers, which in this case is an input transformer. Another place where we can place the transformers is on the entity transformer within the incoming configuration, and that is after the data came in on the incoming configuration. So that is where you can do, for example, your get branches from a pattern to split certain things off, to do certain mapping if that's required on this step already, or any kind of other transformations you would like. If we go on to a route, this is a newly to be created route. We could also place entity transformers over here, again, as many as we would like. And then the final step, or the final place where we could place entity transformers, will be on the outgoing configuration. And here we can also apply as many transformers as we would like. The reason that we have those 4 places to put the entity transformers, well, actually 3 places to put the entity transformers, because the input transformer is slightly different than the other 3 places of the transformers, which is better explained if we look at an overview of like a few routes that are set up. To explain this slightly, we have, for example, 2 web shops having orders for the same system. And then we also have the same web shop going to another place for orders as well. So we pretty much have 2 systems on this side and 2 systems on this side, but they don't provide information to each and all of them. So there is a limitation in like, okay, one system is providing for 2, the other system is providing for just 1. And also the other way around. This also means that you would have to think of where would you like to do your transformations. You could say, for example, I do my transformations on the side of the incoming configuration, but that would also mean if you do your transformation of your mapping, then you cannot provide it for both of the systems. So therefore you could also say, okay, I want to do my transformation on the outgoing configuration, but then again, you would also come from 2 different systems. So within that, you can have like a certain things of thoughts of, okay, where would I like to do my transformation? In this case, for example, it would be best to put it on the routes itself. And therefore on the route transformations, you can do the transformation specifically from one system to that other system. You could also choose, for example, to say, okay, we map orders to a Alumio schema, for example, and then you have orders coming in from one system, you map that towards from the incoming configuration, you map that towards an standard schema, and then from the outgoing configuration you take the standard schema and you map that towards the outgoing system. That, for example, could be a possibility. In this case, we have like many systems connected to many systems. Let's say it's slightly easier than that. Then in most cases, we actually recommend to put the transformations of the mapping towards the outgoing configuration. The reason why we do that has to do with the way that data is shown within the task itself. So if we go to a task overview, for example, you are probably familiar with that you can click on a specific task and you can view the entity data. The entity data that you see here is the data that is happening after the incoming configuration and after the route. So that also means that the transformations of the route already took place the moment that this data is shown. So therefore you could say, okay, this is where I want to see my data that came from the incoming configuration, which then gives me the possibility to have a best practice, as I can show over here. We can copy the data from here. Let's say there's something wrong with this data. I would like to check it, what's happening with it. I go to the outgoing configuration of where this data would go through, and I would open all of the transformations that are connected to that outgoing configuration. From here, I can, of course, paste in my information. I can click on the run test. And as you can see, I added a new queue here. So that is working fine. Then I can copy this information once more. I can close this tab. And I can go to the next transformation and also run the test over here. And I can see that I added the second line of information, or maybe did some changes with the information. Then we can also go once more, copy all of that over here. We can go to the third transformation, which in this case uses the first line and the second line, which were placed by the previous two transformations. And we can run that, and we can see that the data is appended like the way we would like. This is just a slight best practice in which you can look through your transformations. So within this video, we showed you where to place your transformers and showed you a best practice of how you can test your information going through certain transformers and where you would like to place them that way. So with your transformations, there's multiple ways that lead to Rome. There's not necessarily a right or wrong, but there's just a lot of choices to be made. And once you have the knowledge of which choice has which interaction with the system, you can probably make a better choice. We hope that it is provided by this video.